Hi, this is Chuck Stull, continuing our look into the beer industry. Now, the consolidation of the beer industry eliminated many of the small local breweries and most regional brewers. And by the end of the 20th century, these have been replaced by large, efficient breweries with over 10 million barrels per year capacity. But at the end of the 20th century, a group of small brewers, very small brewers, entered the market, trying to serve the niche of consumers who wanted the strongly flavored beer that we often call craft beer. Now, there were a couple of important legal changes. Nationally, homebrewing was legalized in 1978, and various states followed suit at different times, and states began to allow production by small breweries or microbreweries. And these are tiny compared to the minimum efficient scale. But these breweries brought new flavor to the US. Anchor Steam is considered by some to be the grandfather of the craft beer movement. Now, this originally began as a traditional local brewery founded in 1896 serving San Francisco. And it, like many small breweries, struggled to survive the growth of the national breweries, and it was close to closing in 1965. At that point, it was bought by Fritz Maytag, who spent the next decade developing recipes and a new approach to beer brewing. And Anchor Steam gained wide attention and distribution in the 80s, which was also the era where we had a wave of brand new microbreweries. So Sierra Nevada, founded in 1981, also in California. Kalamazoo's Bell Beer, Kalamazoo Brewing, founded in 1983 by Larry Bell, who reportedly began his home brewing career in the dorm at Kalamazoo College. Boston Beer, makers of Sam Adams, founded in 1984, and many others. Now, these craft beers differentiated themselves with stronger flavor. So, Sierra Nevada, Anchor Steam, Sam Adams all have about 30 IBUs. Um, so they're much more bitter than the mainstream US beers at about 10 IBUs, or even the typical European import at 20 IBUs. But the microbrewers also pushed this further. Bell's Two Hearted, a very popular early IPA, clocked in at 60 IBUs, again, unheard of in the old days. And later, others went over 100 IBUs, like Harpoon Leviathan. Now, at some point, the scientific instruments can measure the IBUs, but it's unclear whether humans can taste the additional bitterness. But the microbreweries really enhanced and increased the flavorness and the broad range of flavors available in the US beer market. They also led to an explosion of different beer styles, rediscovering old styles and creating entire new styles. So we have things that are very malty but with moderate hops, like a Scotch ale. We have porters and stouts that are very dark. We have double IPAs, imperial stouts, barley wines, the high gravity beers with much higher alcohol content than a typical beer. Wheat beers became popular. These are less malty um, than a pure barley malt beer, but things like Bell's Oberon or Goose Island 312, the wheat beers tend to be accessible to people who aren't particularly interested in a strong beer flavor. And there were also beers with other flavors, flavored with spices, with fruits, with pumpkins, sour beers. Perhaps the most extreme that I've seen is the Mangalista Pig Porter, which is brewed with pig's heads. This is a very long way from the Bavarian purity law that we opened our beer discussion with. Now, craft brewing can be divided into several different segments. These are all small brewers relative to the um, big national or now multinational brewers, um, but they can have significant differences in size. So the regional specialty brewers, breweries like Anchor Steam, Sierra Nevada, are small brewers, often less than 1 million barrels, but much bigger than the microbreweries. Now, Bell started as a microbrewery, and many of the other ones started as a microbrewery and grew to the size of the regional specialty breweries. Real microbreweries may have definitions dependent on the state license. In Michigan, it is brewing less than 30,000 barrels a year. Oftentimes their actual production is much less than that. Less than 15,000 barrels is common. So some examples of a microbrewery that you might see in Michigan would be New Holland or Shorts. The smallest breweries would be the brew pubs. So Old Peninsula, Bilbo's, Tibbs, Saugatuck here in Kalamazoo, the Bob in Grand Rapids. So these are even smaller. Most of them are selling most of their beer on premise, and many of them associated with the restaurant. And there are thousands of these smaller scale breweries. But all of these firms face a substantial cost disadvantage. We're talking about um, firms that are producing like 0.015 million when the minimum efficient scale is 5.5 million, and a modern efficient brewery would be 8.5 million barrels or more. So we don't have, even in the largest cases, the economies of scale that we would see in an inefficient sized brewery. And the smallest ones have even higher costs. The microbreweries do survive by not trying to compete head to head with those big multinational breweries. They have featured, since the beginning, strong product differentiation. So some of it is producing types of beer, the stouts, porters, ambers, pale ales, weiss beers, beers with stronger flavors, more malty, more hoppy. And because they're so costly to make and they are priced high, they have gained a super premium image above even the imports, and are seen by consumers, again, using that price quality heuristic as the very best quality beers. Now, microbreweries do have some savings on transportation costs. Many of them only serve or specialize in their local markets, so they have less shipping costs, and many of them don't spend very much money on advertising, which saves them some money as well. Now, there is another segment of the craft brewing industry um, known as contract brewing. So sometimes, instead of building new facilities, some firms have taken advantage of the existing excess capacity in the brewing industry. Remember, there were dozens of regional brewers who were going out of business, and hired that brewery to make a product according to their own recipe, to their own specifications. So in some ways, this is the ultimate in vertical disintegration, not even producing your own product. The perhaps favorite example here is the Boston Beer Company, maker of Sam Adams, which initially was almost exclusively a virtual brewer. So Sam Adams would be brewed by Stroh's or other regional brewers, and it became the largest craft brewer by not brewing its own beer. Now, eventually, it did open a brew pub in Boston and purchased its own brewery facility from an old regional brewer, and that was after some successful attack ads by Anheuser-Busch. But the advantage of contract brewing is that they were using larger equipment, and so they were able to take advantage of some economies of scale, perhaps not as much um, as the big national and multinational brewers, but much, much more efficient than a microbrewery. Many of the contract brewers spent more money on advertising, and because you could contract with a West Coast brewery and an East Coast brewery or a Southern brewery, a Midwestern brewery, it would be possible to produce your beer close to the market and control some of those shipping costs. If we look at the last few decades, uh, the U.S. beer industry has been characterized by substantial growth of craft beers. Many other market segments were flat or declining, but the craft brewing grew substantially, and that included continued growth during the recession following the financial crisis, when other beer sales were actually dropping. So we have seen now more breweries than ever before, surpassing even the days when we had beer delivered by horse-drawn carriage. Um, Many thousands of brewers, but each of them, of course, with relatively small market share. Um, Jobs in the beer industry have increased as well. And again, this is in some ways um, uh, very attractive, but it also points to the inefficiency because we're taking a lot more people to produce the same amount of beer. And craft beer production has grown um, as well as the number of breweries and as well as the number of workers. Now, the major breweries didn't ignore this, and they responded initially by trying to imitate the style of craft beers. And a lot of times they focused on the packaging, the labels, and the names. Typically, they were brewing new beers, but with milder flavor than the microbreweries were doing. They also would have a lot of advertising and marketing support, as well as access to distribution channels. Um, some of these brewers would go to fairly long lengths to disguise their ownership. It would never say on the package that it was owned by Anheuser-Busch or by Coors or by Miller. Um, Another strategy was to purchase um, existing small breweries and market it as an independent. So, for example, Leinenkugel's was a small Wisconsin brewery bought by Miller in 1988, and then they really expanded their varieties and their marketing. Blue Moon was developed by Coors, um, and has that again that relatively popular wheat beer approach. But to some extent, these were never as successful as the big brewers hoped that they would be. And they turned to purchasing existing successful microbreweries. Let me look at the first of the really well-known ones, and this was Goose Island. Goose Island was a popular Chicago microbrewery. 312 was their popular wheat beer, so similar to Bell's Oberon in flavor. Um, and 312 is named after the Chicago area code. This was their bestseller. Enough people wanted to buy it that it was hard for them to keep up their production, and they had to cut one of their more distinctive beers in order to maintain volume. In 2011, Anheuser-Busch InBev purchased Goose Island, and they went from making 50-barrel batches to 1,000-barrel batches, so taking advantage of those economies of scale. And that meant that it was much cheaper to produce a barrel of Goose Island beer when it was produced by AB InBev than it had been when it was produced in the small Chicago facility. And then the brewers has um, that choice. Should they keep price high in order to take a high profit, or should they cut price in order to increase market share? What Anheuser-Busch seems to have done, at least in the marketing their beers to bars, is that they would regularly discount their kegs. So every other week, dropping prices from $158 to $110, which was a very attractive price for a microbrew in order to grow the Goose Island brand nationally. AB InBev didn't stop with the purchase of Goose Island. They created a whole division known as the High End to manage their microbreweries. So these are all companies that started independently and then were purchased by Anheuser-Busch or the combined Anheuser-Busch InBev. So Goose Island, 2011, 10 Barrel Brewing in Oregon, 2014, Golden Road, 2015, Breckenridge out of Colorado in 2015, Four Peaks in 2015, Elysian in Seattle, 2015, Devil's Backbone in Virginia, 2016, Carbach in Texas, 2016, Blue Point and Wicked Weed in 2017. And of course, AB InBev wasn't the only one doing the buying. If we look at the Miller Coors joint venture at that point, they also created their own division. Again, this is before Miller was acquired by AB InBev, but their division was 10th and Blake, and they purchased Terrapin in Georgia, Revolver in Texas, St. Archer in California, and Hop Valley in Oregon. We also had some of the international brewers purchasing U.S. microbreweries. So Heineken bought half of Lagunitas in 2015, and in 2017 they bought the other half. So Lagunitas is a wholly owned subsidiary of Heineken. Constellation, a brewery created by antitrust negotiation, purchased Ballast Point for something like $1 billion in 2015. And Mahu, was a Spanish brewery, bought Founders in Grand Rapids, initially 30% in 2014, and then in 2019 going up over 90%. Now, after the merger between Miller and AB InBev, the part of that agreement is that the new company, the new AB InBev, needs to notify Department of Justice before any acquisition of a brewery, even if it's so small that it wouldn't be required for a Hart-Scott-Rodino review. And AB InBev also agreed to avoid using its power over distributors, the wholesalers, to hurt small competitors. And that was part of the negotiations that allowed the Miller AB InBev merger to go through. Now, the impact of acquisitions was a little bit interesting. There were people who asked, is a craft beer brewed by a multinational still a craft beer? Does it taste the same? Often, yes. But do consumers see it the same? Not always. 312, right, that Chicago area code beer, is brewed in Baldwinsville, New York. There were hate tourists who went to Elysian, the Seattle brewery, after it was purchased, would go into the bar, buy a beer, and literally dump it on the floor, simply because they couldn't stand the idea of their local brewery being owned by a multinational. Now, on the good side for the purchased microbreweries is that they had many more resources than they had in the past. So they had more money to expand. They could take advantage of economies of scale. They might have better access to specialty hops. And the buyer, the big multinationals, right, had better control over distribution. And so they were able to get often some better placement in stores and in restaurants for their brands. There were, for independent craft brewers who didn't want to sell out, some alternatives that would let them have access to capital, to more money, to expand and grow their business. So one was to sell a minority stake, to have partial ownership. So Founders, of course, started with that and then went to full ownership. Brooklyn Brewery sold about a quarter of its ownership to Kirin out of Japan. There have been recent years private equity investors who are bringing capital to microbreweries. So Artisanal Brewing Ventures in Southern Tier, Victory Brewing is a model example of that. Greg Koch of Stone Brewing announced a private equity angel venture funding to support independent small brewers, and there's many other companies have done that. Contract brewing and guest brewing allows companies to expand their beer production without having a big capital investment, and we've seen some of that in the independent brewing industry. And then we've seen mergers between microbreweries or regional specialty breweries. So, for example, Boston Beer, makers of Sam Adams, merged with Dogfish Head in 2019. So we still have a segment of this industry made up of independent craft brewers, and these are ones that are not owned by by a multinational brewer, and they continue to produce strongly flavored beers, often sold locally. One problem they have is that only a small fraction of US beer drinkers prefer these strong flavors, and it's difficult for the mass market brewers to sell enough to take advantage of economies of scale. Guinness might be the one exception of a strongly flavored beer, which has something like 6 million barrels capacity per year. But that strong product differentiation does allow these small, inefficient breweries to compete with the global giants. But it's again a market niche, high priced, over $20 for a 12 pack is not unusual, sometimes over $25 for a 4 pack for certain beers. If we look at the overall sales of beer in the United States, we can see craft beer, which is the third from the top on this, has grown to be a very respectable segment of the market. It's selling more than the budget beers and is approaching the volume of the premium beers. But it's far, far behind the most popular beers, which are the light beers. If we look at the most popular beer brands in the United States, they don't look at all like these heavily flavored beers made by microbreweries or craft beers. The top selling US beer brands, based on an article from March of 2020, Bud Light, Coors Light, Miller Lite, Bud, Michelob Ultra, and Corona. So while craft beer gave us a revolution in flavor, consumers now have much more choice, but the biggest volume is still in the lightly flavored beers, and even more so in the most lightly flavored of those, the light beers. This is Chuck Stull finishing our videos on the US beer industry. Thanks for listening from Kalamazoo College.